Dr. Michelle Taylor, a renowned heart surgeon, is completing long shifts at her private practice in Boston. She had just taken off her surgical gloves and was about to go home to rest when her phone suddenly rang. Michelle picked up the phone, and a man's urgent voice rang out on the other end of the line. "Dr. Taylor, I'm Sheriff Andrew Carter of Springdale. My daughter, Emily, who was only 16 years old, had just suffered a serious heart attack. The doctors here say that his condition is very critical. They can't operate. I beg you, only you can save her." Andrew's trembling voice made Michelle pause. The desperation in the words of a father, especially a powerful sheriff, made her understand that the situation was serious. But she still kept calm and focused to exploit more information. "Mr. Carter, I need to know more about Emily's current condition. What has the hospital over there done?" Andrew's voice choked up. "I have severe arrhythmias due to birth defects. The doctors here are not professional enough to operate. If you don't arrive in time, she won't survive." Hearing these words, Michelle clearly felt the pressure weighing on her. In a short moment, thoughts about professional responsibility and the value of human life rush in. For her, the medical profession is not about fame or money, but about protecting fragile lives. "Immediately send Emily's medical records via email to me." "I'll come right away," she said firmly, her voice calm but determined. As soon as the call ended, Michelle rushed into action. She quickly arranged the necessary equipment for the surgery and left the clinic less than 20 minutes later. On the way, she opened Emily's medical records on her laptop. Each page of the document further clarifies the complexity of this case. Emily has a heart septal defect, a life-threatening condition if not operated on in time. When driving out of Boston in the dark, Michelle doesn't allow herself to be distracted. But in her heart, a worry crept in. Will I make it in time? With each passing minute, Emily's chances of survival decreased. A sense of responsibility and a desire to save her life led Michelle to enter a race against time, a race she knew she couldn't afford to lose. Michelle walked quickly through the lobby of Springdale Hospital. Her high heels slammed to the floor, creating a definitive sound. She had just escaped stressful moments when she was stopped on the street by the town police. Her eyes were cold, but her face could not hide her tiredness and anxiety. At the door of the emergency room, Sheriff Andrew Carter was waiting, tall but his face was full of uneasiness. When he saw Michelle approaching, he hurriedly strode closer, his big hand squeezing her shoulder lightly as a gesture of appreciation. "Dr. Taylor, thank you for coming. Emily is very weak." His voice choked up, his eyes fixed on Michelle as if clinging to a fragile glimmer of hope. Michelle nodded, her voice low and firm. "I will do everything I can. But before I start, I need to talk to you." The assertiveness in Michelle's voice made Carter stunned. He nodded and motioned for her to follow him into a small conference room nearby. The door closed, creating a quiet space, with only two people facing each other. Michelle stood up straight, her eyes full of determination. "Sheriff Carter, I understand your daughter's emergency, but I need you to know that I was just stopped on the street by your police. They suspected me, just because I was a woman of color, driving into town in the middle of the night." Carter's eyes flashed with surprise and embarrassment. He took a step back, as if Michelle's words hit his self-esteem hard. I'm sorry, doctor. That shouldn't happen. I will deal with this matter immediately." Michelle clenched her hands, her voice stiffened. "I'm not here to ask for an apology. I'm here to save your daughter." But he had to understand, if I hadn't been tough, if I hadn't kept my composure, Emily might have lost her chance of survival. "I need you to make sure that no one else will have to go through this." Carter lowered his head, his shoulders heavy. He took a deep breath before looking up, his eyes full of determination. "Dr. Taylor, you're right. I made the mistake of not controlling the bias in my team. I promise to solve this problem. But now, please save Emily. She's everything to me." Michelle looked him straight in the eye, seeing the sincerity and despair in it. She nodded and let go of the table. "I need to prepare immediately. Send me all of Emily's medical records, and keep your promise." Carter nodded vigorously, his eyes following Michelle as she left, his footsteps not slowing down for a second. In his heart, shame and gratitude are intertwined. He knew that he had not only relied on a good doctor, but also had to face his own mistakes. Michelle rushed towards the operating room, her mind quickly focused on the task at hand. But deep down in my mind, the contemptuous eyes, the sarcasm from those policemen are still imprinted. She knew that to change such prejudices was not a matter of one day or two. But she wouldn't back down. Her responsibility is not only to save people, but also to prove that talent and dedication do not depend on skin color. Springdale Hospital was plunged into heavy silence as Michelle walked out of the emergency room. The white light from the corridor made everything colder, but that couldn't be compared to the emptiness that was invading her heart. Her hands were still shaking slightly after the last attempts in the emergency room, but all was in vain. She saw Sheriff Carter sitting on a bench in the hallway, his big shoulders shaking from time to time. It is no longer a powerful man, but only a father who has just lost his only daughter. Michelle slowed down, her shoes making a small but heavy sound. As she approached Carter, she bent down, gently placing her hand on his shoulder. He raised his head, his eyes red with tears and pain. "I'm sorry, Mr. Carter," Michelle said, her voice hoarse, every word choking. "I did all I could, but we took too long." Carter looked at her, his eyes blank at first, but then gradually changed. From grief, it turned to anger, and the fire of indignation flared up strongly in his eyes. He stood up, startling Michelle for a moment. "Who got in your way?" His voice was hoarse but powerful. "Who made you unable to make it in time?" Michelle took a deep breath, trying to keep her calm in her heart. She knew this moment would not be easy. "Two of your policemen stopped me on the road," she said, every word clear and unequivocal. "They don't believe me, they don't believe a woman of color can be a doctor. They laughed when I said I was called to save your daughter." Carter clenched his hands, his knuckles white from the energy he put into it. He turned, walking back and forth in the hallway as if trying to control a rage that wanted to explode. "They took my daughter," he roared, his voice choked between pain and anger. "Just because of that stupidity, that blind discrimination." Michelle was silent, giving him time to vent his anger. Her heart was also full of emotions. Even though it wasn't her fault, she still couldn't stop feeling guilty. If she had come earlier, if there had been no delay, "They're going to pay the price," Carter declared, his voice now low but determined. "I swear to Emily, I'm not going to let this sink." Michelle nodded, her gaze meeting his. The two of them seemed to find harmony in pain and determination. "I have a camera in the car," she said. "It recorded the whole thing. If you need proof, I'm ready to provide it." Carter nodded, his eyes flashing with hope. "I will clarify this, not only for Emily but also for justice. No one is allowed to behave like that. No one has the right to take another person's life just because of prejudice." Michelle watched him as he walked quickly toward the phone to call the sheriff's office. Although the pain of loss was still heavy in her heart, she felt a change. Carter's anger was not just personal grief but became a fire that drove him to seek justice. Michelle stood silently in the hallway, her eyes distant. Although she could not save Emily, she knew she had to help Carter and others stand up against injustice. That is the only way to turn this pain into something meaningful. Sheriff Carter walked into his office, his shoulders heavy with guilt and responsibility. The image of Emily, his daughter, is still intact in her mind. Her bright smile every day is now only a heartbreaking memory. He sat down in his chair. His gaze stopped on the police badge placed in front of him. That little thing used to be a symbol of pride and fairness, but now it only adds to his bitter feelings. He bowed his head, clutching the badge in his hand, as if looking for a promise from the past. "I swore to protect everyone," he whispered, his voice lost. "But I let this same system take my daughter's life." That desperation was soon replaced by a strong determination. He stood up, his eyes shining with determination. Carter knew he couldn't let this pain be just another sad story forgotten in history. If he didn't act, if he didn't fight, Emily's death would be meaningless. Immediately, He called an emergency meeting with the entire police force. When everyone was full, he stepped forward. His eyes swept across the room. The atmosphere was suffocating, tense, as everyone realized the seriousness of his expression. Emily Carter died of unnecessary delay. Carter began, his voice deep but weighty. Delay because of the people I trust to protect and serve, again to prejudice to lead the way. Delay because you have forgotten your oath. The whole room was silent. Some of the officers bowed their heads, a look of confusion evident on their faces. Carter continued, his words piercing their hearts. Our job is not to judge people based on their skin color, gender, or anything other than their actions. But that didn't happen last night. You've failed, and so have I, for not leading you properly. His voice trembled slightly, but his eyes were still resolute. He is not criticizing anyone alone, but it is his responsibility to clarify the truth. I can't change what happened, but I will make sure this never repeats. From now on, all officers in the force will have to participate in a training program on anti-bias and emergency crisis management. Every action you take from now on will be closely monitored. I will not let any mistake take another life. He paused, letting his words sink into their minds. Some people began to shake their heads. Their opposition was obvious, but Carter raised his hand, his eyes sharp as a knife. If any of you feel unable to comply or disagree, submit your badge now. We have no room for weakness or prejudice in this work. No one stood up or walked out. The atmosphere in the room was heavy, but Carter recognized it as a sign of self-questioning. After the meeting, Carter walked into the office, looking at the stack of documents on the table. He knows his responsibility doesn't stop at words. Immediately, he contacted city management to push for reform in the police industry. He signed each document to begin the internal investigation process, not hesitating to confront anyone involved in the mistake that caused Emily's death. During that time, Michelle also went to see Carter with a tape recording of the entire incident. She put the USB on the table, her eyes steadfast. I believe you're going to do the right thing, she said, her voice calm but meaningful. Carter nodded, holding the USB in his hand. I promise, he replied, not just for Emily, but for all the people that this system has ever hurt. That night, as he sat alone in his office, Carter looked back at Emily's picture on the table. He touched her face in the photo, and the pain surged like a big wave. But he knew he couldn't stop. His pain has become a source of motivation to change, to correct mistakes. And he will do everything in his power to turn this loss into a wake-up call, a commitment to true justice. The day the news of Emily Carter's death spread, the whole town was engulfed in a gloomy atmosphere. Initially, whispers crept through cafes, schools, and markets. Some people can't believe that this tragedy happened in a place as peaceful as this town. But when the details of the cause of death were announced, silence gave way to outrage. On the streets, people began to gather, initially in small groups, but the numbers increased rapidly. Michelle stood in the middle of the crowd, the signed justice for Emily firmly held in her hand. Her eyes burned with determination. This is not only the pain of Emily's family, but has become a symbol of the long-standing injustice in the legal system. At the first gathering in the central square, Michelle stepped onto the podium, her voice sounding strong and full of emotion. Emily Carter is more than just a victim. She is a girl, a friend, a part of this community. And today, we stand here not only to mourn her, but to demand justice. This system has failed not only for Emily but also for all those who are oppressed by prejudice and apathy. The loud applause was like a wave rising from the crowd. Michelle felt the unity, but she also recognized the pain in their eyes. Many of them are people who used to be silent about the same injustices, but now, they can no longer turn a blind eye. In another corner of the square, an elderly man quietly wiped away tears. He was a longtime friend of the Carter family, and this loss made him unbearable. He saw young faces in the crowd who stood up for the first time to fight. The whole town seemed to be boiling. On social networks, the hashtag Justice for Emily quickly spread, attracting attention not only from the town but also from the surrounding areas. Many shared Emily's story, condemning police delays and calling for system reform. However, not everyone agrees. Some residents are indifferent, even annoyed by the wave of protests. "It's annoying," one woman muttered as she walked past the crowd. "The death of a person is not worth such a disturbance." But their silence could not stop the power of the collective voice. Every day, the number of people participating in the protests is increasing, not only limited to the community of color but also to people of all walks of life and ethnicities. Sheriff Carter watched things from his office. Through the window, he saw the crowd below. They were constantly calling for justice, constantly demanding change. In his heart was a mixture of pain, guilt, and hope. On the stage, an elderly woman grabbed the microphone, her voice trembling but full of emotion. "I've lived my whole life in this town and think I know it well. But Emily's death has shown me that even the most peaceful places have dark corners that we need to face." Her words touched everyone. A loud applause rang out, mixed with the shouts. "Justice for Emily! Justice for all of us!" The protests are not only a call for Emily but also an opportunity for the community to heal and change. People who have never participated in a movement before now take to the streets, donating their strength, even if it is just a small thing such as providing drinking water or helping to prepare banners. As night falls, the light from the candles lights up the square. People came together to say prayers, not only for Emily but for the future of the town. A sense of hope creeps into the air, hope that from grief, they will find the strength to build a better community. Michelle stood in the empty living room of Emily's house, her eyes fixed on the family photo on the table. In the photo, Emily is smiling brightly, her eyes sparkling with joy. The image was like a knife slashed deep into Michelle's heart, reminding her that Emily was no more. Michelle closed her eyes and took a deep breath. In that moment, all the memories of Emily rushed back. The times the two organized charity activities together, all-night talks about the future and dreams. Emily had been a beacon to those around her, and now Michelle knew that she had to become. In the midst of pain and loss, Michelle felt a deep sense of gratitude. Without Emily, she thought, I wouldn't have had the courage to stand up to injustice. It was Emily who instilled in her the spirit of struggle, courage, and the will not to give in. Michelle didn't let herself drown in suffering for too long. She quickly got into action. She began reaching out to journalists, social organizations, and activists in the area. Her voice through each phone call was strong and steadfast, as if no one could refuse to listen. Emily's death can't be a statistic, Michelle told a reporter. She's a human being, part of this community. And we will not stop fighting for justice, not just for her but for all those who are not being heard. Every morning, Michelle sits at her desk, planning her next activities. The plan board hung on the wall, densely packed with notes and schedules, from organizing protests to meetings with government representatives. Whenever she felt exhausted, Michelle looked at Emily's photo on her desk. "I'm doing this for you," she whispered. Many times Michelle faced opposition and skepticism. Some called her a troublemaker. Others said that all her efforts were in vain. But instead of being discouraged, she used those criticisms as motivation. Emily won't give up, Michelle told herself. And I can't either. At a community meeting, Michelle walked onto the stage, her eyes fixed on the people sitting in front of her. Her voice rang out, trembling in the first sentences but then gradually became stronger. "We can't change the past, but we can change the future. I know Emily would want us to do it. Not just for her but for all those who are being forgotten and oppressed." After the speech, an elderly woman came to Michelle, her eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "Thank you for speaking for our hearts." That thank you was like a ray of light in Michelle's heart. She realized that she wasn't just fighting alone. She has the support of an entire community, people who were once scared but now find hope and strength in her actions. Michelle is not only grateful for the love and support Emily once gave her, but also for the valuable lesson that Emily's death left behind. Nothing is stronger than solidarity and faith in justice. That motivated her to move forward, despite all the difficulties ahead. After ordering an investigation and firing 2 police officers for racist behavior, Sheriff Carter felt a transformation within himself. Initially, he was just a painful father, losing his daughter to the reproach and prejudice of those he once trusted. But now he became a different man, one who not only faced personal loss, but also stood firm for the values he had fought for all his life to protect. When Sheriff Carter stood in front of the camera, his face was no longer a vague pain, but instead one of determination and strength. The light illuminated the wrinkles on his face, but he couldn't obscure the light of determination in his eyes. He knew that what he was doing today was not just to avenge his daughter, but to change a system that had long been unfair. He gripped the microphone tightly, and a deep and powerful voice rang out. The actions of these two officers are not only a violation of professional ethics, but also an affront to the principles of justice and fairness that we have always proudly defended. Racism cannot and never will have a place in our police force. Every word he spoke was like an unshakable commitment. Sheriff Carter has not only faced his own pain but also found the strength to fight for something greater, for those who can't speak up and for a more just society. When the press conference ended, Carter didn't feel relieved, but he felt proud. He knew that this was just the first step. The change he wants to see cannot come from a single decision, but needs to be a revolution in the thinking and action of the entire community. After that event, Sheriff Carter continued to receive support from people in the community. A section of the public that had been skeptical of the possibility of change in the police force now began to see him as a symbol of justice. Carter was no longer just the head of public authority, but a model of courage and principle who dared to face what was wrong at the cost of personal losses. He also faced opposition from some sections of the police force who were unhappy with his criticism of his colleagues. But Carter doesn't care about those criticisms. He knew that change was never easy, and he was willing to face any challenge. He spends time attending community meetings, meeting with people affected by racism, and making sure they can trust his leadership. Sheriff Carter not only wants to right the wrongs of the past, but he also wants to build a fair and credible police force for the future. Day by day, his steadfastness caused many people to change their opinions. Carter is not just a man who stands up for justice, but a leader that the whole community can put faith in. The change he initiated gradually spread, and in his heart, a new hope was lit. Hope for a society where there was no room for discrimination or injustice. Sheriff Carter understands that the fight will not be easy and will drag on, but he never looks back. He became a symbol not only of justice, but also of inner strength, of the ability to stand up and change when everything seemed lost.